Many argue that when it comes to pure, unadulterated technical skill, no one has ever surpassed the mastery of Mr. Perfect inside the squared circle, the industry's original perfectionist, a man who could effortlessly dominate any athletic endeavor. Yet, in the year 2003, a single, fateful choice would set in motion a chain of events that did far more than simply bring his wrestling career to a close. That decision would tragically culminate in the end of his very life. The story begins in 1958, when Curt Hennig was born into the world in Robbinsdale, Minnesota. He was born into wrestling royalty as the son of Larry the Axe Hennig, a man universally respected within the professional wrestling business. Young Curt spent his childhood absorbing the intricate knowledge of the industry, an education that would prove invaluable in his future. For the Hennig family, professional wrestling was far more than mere entertainment on a television screen. It was the very fabric of their existence, their way of life. From a very young age, it was profoundly evident that Curt was a gifted athlete. By the time he reached high school, his natural talents were undeniable. He seemed to excel at everything he attempted. He was heavily pursued by football teams, and basketball coaches were constantly trying to recruit him to their squads, as he had a unique ability to make every complex athletic feat look effortless. However, in spite of the numerous opportunities being presented to him, Curt's heart was already set on a singular path for his future. Following in the celebrated footsteps of his father, he felt the undeniable pull of the professional wrestling ring. The moment Curt began his training under the legendary Vern Gagne, one thing became immediately and abundantly clear. Curt Hennig was a true prodigy inside the ropes. Where most aspiring wrestlers required months or even years of grueling practice to grasp the fundamentals, Curt absorbed every technique instantaneously, moving with the fluidity of a seasoned veteran who had been performing his entire life. When he began his professional journey in the AWA back in 1980, Curt immediately felt the immense weight of expectation pressing down on his shoulders. The comparisons were constant and relentless. Everyone saw him as the successor to his father, the notoriously tough Larry the Axe Hennig. For a young man just finding his way in the industry, it was an incredibly daunting shadow to emerge from. It was precisely this environment that led him, in 1981, to eagerly accept an opportunity to join Vince McMahon Sr.'s burgeoning World Wrestling Federation. His initial tenure there was brief, however, as he chose to return home with his wife, expecting their first child. Yet, even in that limited time, he had made a significant impression on Vince McMahon Jr., who saw a spark of something extraordinary. His subsequent return to the AWA would prove to be an exceptionally wise career decision. Back in the AWA, Curt formed a dynamic partnership with a rising star named Scott Hall, and the duo captured the AWA World Tag Team Championships. Their team would ultimately be remembered as one of the final truly great pairings in the promotion's storied history. But it was when Curt embarked on his solo career that his star truly began to ascend. The year 1987 marked the most significant milestone of his career to that point, when he achieved wrestling immortality by defeating the iconic Nick Bockwinkel to claim the coveted AWA World Heavyweight Championship. This victory was a monumental achievement, not only for Curt himself, but for the entire Hennig family legacy. With this prestigious championship win, he had at last and definitively stepped out from the colossal shadow cast by his famous father. He would successfully defend that prestigious title for over a year. But as the 1980s drew to a close, the AWA as a promotion was facing serious financial difficulties. The once dominant organization, a staple of the wrestling world for decades, was beginning to crumble under financial pressure. Fortunately for Curt, Vince McMahon had never forgotten the exceptionally talented performer he had briefly employed years earlier. Just as the AWA was teetering on the brink of collapse, McMahon reached out with a life-altering proposition that would redefine Curt Hennig's career forever. Upon Curt's return to the WWF in 1988, Vince McMahon was absolutely astonished by the incredible transformation he had undergone. The promising young talent who had passed through his company years ago had blossomed into a polished, complete main event performer. Now, all he needed was a distinctive character, a unique persona that would make him unforgettable to a global audience. And from that need, the unforgettable character of Mr. Perfect was conceived. By leveraging Curt's genuine background as a phenomenal, multi-talented athlete who excelled at any sport he touched, McMahon recognized they were sitting on a potential gold mine. This led to the creation of the now legendary vignettes, which showcased Mr. Perfect performing extraordinary athletic feats. He was shown sinking seemingly impossible basketball shots, throwing flawless spirals with a football, and even rolling a perfect 300 game in bowling. And while a few of these incredible stunts required several attempts to capture on film, Curt's innate athletic prowess meant that he was genuinely capable of performing most of these amazing feats without any trick photography. For instance, during his time aligned with Ric Flair, while the Nature Boy delivered one of his signature passionate promos, the audience's eyes would invariably drift to Mr. Perfect in the background, whose priceless facial expressions and subtle reactions elevated the entire segment. Their on-screen partnership blossomed into a genuine, close friendship off-screen, which came as no surprise to anyone who knew Curt's magnetic personality. Backstage, he had a well-earned reputation for being one of the most universally liked individuals in the entire locker room. He was famous for his incredible sense of humor, always prepared with a perfectly timed joke or a clever prank to break the tension and lighten the atmosphere. He was the kind of person who possessed the rare gift of making his colleagues laugh, even on the most difficult of days. However, beneath the cheerful exterior that kept everyone else smiling, Curt was engaged in a silent, personal struggle. The condition of his severely injured back was deteriorating, forcing him to become increasingly dependent on potent painkillers simply to endure the daily agony. Indeed, despite no longer being an active competitor and taking physical punishment in the ring, the chronic pain from his accumulated injuries was a relentless and constant companion that simply refused to subside. The 1992 Survivor Series pay-per-view was promoted around a massive main event tag team match, pitting the Ultimate Warrior and Macho Man Randy Savage against the duo of Ric Flair and Razor Ramon. But disaster struck just before the pivotal event, when the Ultimate Warrior abruptly departed from the company, leaving Vince McMahon in an incredibly difficult and desperate position. After scrambling through his remaining options, McMahon turned to Curt. It would be the first time in his WWF run that he would be cast as a hero, but in the same way he handled every other challenge in his career, Curt made the transition look absolutely seamless. The audience, which had spent years booing him as a villain, now erupted with cheers as he famously defeated his former ally Ric Flair, forcing him out of the promotion in a loser leaves town match in January of 1993. Following that significant victory, he engaged in memorable rivalries with up-and-coming superstars such as Shawn Michaels and Lex Luger. Yet it was clear to many that something fundamental had changed this time. The unfortunate and sad reality was that the years of injuries had taken their toll. Curt simply could not perform in the ring with the same explosive agility as before, a fact that was painfully obvious to him and to the fans watching. By 1996, Vince McMahon was making a concerted effort to persuade Mr. Perfect to make one final dramatic return to active competition in the ring. The timing of this request struck many as quite odd, considering Curt was on the verge of receiving a substantial $300,000 payout from his insurance policy, funds he specifically intended to use to secure his retirement. Then, completely unexpectedly, the insurance company, Lloyd's of London, suddenly refused to issue the payment. This raised deep suspicions for Curt, who began to believe that Vince McMahon might have intervened behind the scenes to financially pressure him into returning to work. And while no concrete evidence ever emerged to prove this accusation one way or the other, the entire suspicious ordeal created a lasting sense of bitterness and deep resentment for Curt. Feeling betrayed and angered by the entire insurance situation, Curt reached out to Eric Bischoff and defected to the competition, WCW. Years later, after returning to the WWE, his tenure there would come to an abrupt end following the notorious incident known as the plane ride from hell. Indeed, on a transatlantic flight returning from the United Kingdom to the United States, a number of wrestlers behaved erratically, but Curt's particular actions were notably extreme. Even amidst the widespread pandemonium, violently slammed against the plane's emergency exit door, a terrifying moment that could have resulted in an unthinkable catastrophe. In the aftermath of that infamous flight, once all the details came to light, several performers were released from their contracts, and Curt Hennig was unfortunately one of them. Over the ensuing months, Curt navigated the independent wrestling circuit, making appearances for smaller promotions. However, the final chapter of Curt Hennig's story was beginning to unfold, and it would reach its tragic conclusion on February 10, 2003. He was scheduled for a performance at the Florida State Fair that evening, part of his determined effort to reclaim his place at the pinnacle of the industry he adored. But at 10 p.m. that night, in a heartbreaking moment that would send shockwaves through the entire wrestling community, a housekeeper at his hotel made a truly devastating discovery. Curt's body was discovered in his room at the tragically young age of 44, survived by a wife and 4 children who were suddenly forced to face a future without their incredible father. A loved one later expressed, "I lost somebody that meant the world to me. He wasn't only my dad, he was like a brother. He was my hero." That profound grief was amplified when the Hillsborough County Medical Examiner's Office released its official report on March 26, 2003. The formal cause of death was determined to be acute cocaine intoxication. However, in a story all too common for that era of professional wrestling, the headline didn't tell the whole story. For Curt's father, Larry "the Axe" Hennig, the official explanation simply didn't make sense. Speaking on the record in the book The Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, The Heels, Larry gave voice to the persistent questions that troubled him. "It's not quite clear to me yet, and perhaps it never will be," he stated. Sharing his own perspective, he theorized, "From my standpoint, it just looked like it was one of those one-night deals. Got in with the wrong people." In stark contrast to many veteran performers who jealously guarded their professional secrets, Curt embraced the philosophy of passing on the wisdom he had accumulated over his career. Absolutely, he was following the noble example previously set by figures like Roddy Piper, taking innumerable younger talents under his mentorship, a group that notably included a future megastar in Brock Lesnar. As his peer Sean Waltman would later recollect, Curt considered it his professional obligation to educate the next generation. But perhaps the most enduring memory of Curt was his remarkable ability to completely energize any room just by walking into it. The iconic Stone Cold Steve Austin once remarked that he never once saw Curt in a bad mood, while countless others have shared stories of how he could single-handedly elevate the morale of even the most dejected and somber locker room. Today, his powerful legacy is carried on by his son, Curtis Axel, who proudly represents the Hennig name inside the ring. Before every single match, Curtis is known to take a quiet moment to pray to his father. Even though his personal story concluded far too soon, his enduring legacy thrives through the countless phenomenal matches he left for posterity, the many performers he inspired, and the indelible memories he crafted for wrestling fans all over the world.